Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. On State of Mind, we often explore the complex and challenging realities of mental health. In many of our episodes, we focus on the lived experiences of those who grapple with their own struggles with mental illness and substance use. But today, we're turning the lens to a different perspective. Instead, in this episode, we'll be focusing on the unique and often heart-wrenching journey of mothers who have adult children struggling with mental health disorders and addiction. These mothers face a profound and enduring challenge. They love deeply and offer care and shelter, but their love alone can't fix the problem, and sometimes they find themselves at risk. What does it mean to be a mother through this kind of pain? How do you maintain hope, boundaries, and resilience? Today, we'll hear their stories and explore how mothers cope, learn more about what they need, and about the toll it takes on their lives. It's a side of mental health and addiction that's rarely spoken about, but it's time we listen. Today, we're joined by two guests, Judith Smith and Cathy Pereyra. Later in the program, we'll also be hearing from a number of older women who find themselves in this difficult parenting situation. Let me tell you more about the guests here with us today. Judith R. Smith, who goes by Judy, is a New York City-based psychotherapist, a professor, and a researcher on women's issues. She's a professor emerita at Fordham University. She also offers online support groups for mothers with difficult adult children. Her work is unique in the mental health world because Judith focuses not on the person with the illness, but on the older women and mothers who become the default safety net for their adult children. Her book, Difficult Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change, is based on a 3-year research project. The book brings to life the stories of 50 women, each over 60 years old, whose lives were drastically altered by their adult children's vulnerability when coping with serious mental illness. Dr. Smith discovered that mothers perceived their adult children's behavior as difficult when they found themselves once again prioritizing their children's needs over their own and saw no exit for themselves or their adult children from their problems. Also with us is Cathy Pereyra, who was born and raised in the Northern California Bay Area. Cathy started a sales rep firm in the early 1980s and worked with her husband for 31 years. They raised 2 boys who were both healthy until the youngest developed schizophrenia at age 19. After attending a NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, family support group for a few years and learning more about mental illness, Cathy volunteered to become a co-facilitator for the NAMI family support groups, helping others gain knowledge and resources while providing support to help others navigate this tough and sometimes scary road. Because the topic of an adult loved one moving back home is something she's familiar with, Cathy offered to come on our show to share her story and some of her insights in order to empower and bring hope to others going through similar circumstances. Welcome to State of Mind, Judy and Cathy.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Deborah. It's great to be here and be with you both this morning.
Well, Judy, I want to start with you. What led you to explore this topic of mothering later in life, and why did you choose to specifically focus on mothers with their challenging adult children?
Well, first of all, for most of my career, I was studying mothers with young children. I was a child developmental researcher, and this was my frame of reference. But then I actually got older, and my son got older, and his friends got older, and I was curious what my colleagues were writing about mothering adult kids, because suddenly I had an adult child. And I was shocked to see how little was out there. I just think it's curious, and it raises all kinds of questions about how older women and mothers are just not seen in so many ways. But my colleagues have not yet written about what it's like to be an older mother, and certainly nothing about what it's like to be an older mother when your kids start having problems. So I was a qualitative researcher and I decided this was what I was going to take on. And I started as a qualitative researcher does, going into community centers, senior centers, talking to older women, trying to find out who had an adult child who they were worried about. And I didn't know what they were going to be worried about. Were they worried that their kids were marrying somebody out of their faith? Were they worried that they weren't visiting more? That's what my mother would have said. But instead, the women who chose to speak with me had kids with serious mental illness or substance use. So that's really what my life work has become about, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Now, I can imagine that some folks may have negative reaction to using the term difficult to describe this type of parenting. Why did you decide to use that word to frame this conversation and to title your book?
Well, I was warned by colleagues, don't use that word. We don't call clients difficult. But the truth was, as a qualitative researcher, what I was hearing from everyone I talked to is how difficult this situation was. Not that their kid was bad or should be judged as difficult, but being a mother and trying to be a good mother and trying to protect one's adult child when the son or daughter has serious mental illness or substance use becomes strained and difficult because often what you want to do is you want your kid to get all the help they can. You want them to follow the doctor's advice, but your kids are now adults and they can choose not to take their medication. They can choose to stop talking to you. And because they are adults, they have legal rights and you are not the powerful mom who can kiss a boo-boo and make it right. And over again, in different ways, moms were telling me how hard this was. And really, the book could have been called Difficult Mothering, because that's really what it's about, all the conflicts that emerge for women when they are in this situation.
Can you share a story from your research that exemplifies the difficulty of this situation, both for the mother and for her adult child?
Sure, I guess one person who comes to mind is Faith, who was 80 years old when I met her. She had come to a senior legal service agency to find out how she could evict her daughter from her home. Because actually, if you allow your adult child to move in, they get tenants' rights. So it's very hard to evict them. So she wanted to know what she could do to evict them. And the reason she wanted to evict them is she had recently seen her physician who told her that her blood pressure was dangerously high. And she had to remove the stress that was in her life. Otherwise, she was putting herself at risk. Well, she knew that the stress that was in her life was living with her adult child, and she also had a grandson, her daughter's son, living with her, both of whom had bipolar disease, had been living there for the last 2 years after the mom had gotten cancer and couldn't take care of herself. So she was in this terrible dilemma of what do I do? They were all living in a tiny New York City apartment, so they were on top of each other. And what was difficult for Faith is she needed more quiet in her life. She was 80 years old. The kids, the daughter and the son's schedule didn't match hers. They would often start cooking at 11 o'clock at night when she had to sleep. So it was really hard for her to take care of herself and have them there. But she also saw the situation from her point of view. I mean, I didn't talk to her daughter, but Faith was actually able to tell me what was difficult for her daughter is her daughter wanted to be in it. She was an adult. She was 52 years old. She wanted to have her own apartment. She wanted to be raising her son to the best that she could. And each time her mother would say, please be quiet, or why did you eat my food? It made her feel like, she was a kid again, living in her mother's situation. So they both were under a lot of strain as they tried to live together when really they both needed to live separately. But the situation made it very difficult for them to do so.
I'm curious, as you talk to so many people, what were some of the factors that were common that led to these adult children coming back home?
Well, often it was financial, not being able to continue to work, not being able to continue to stay in school. Some of them were living with romantic partners and that fell apart. So they had no place to live. So the primary reason was they had no place to live. The reasons that the kids had mental illness problems, they had substance use issues, but the thing that often made the young men and young women, or they were older, come back is because they couldn't afford and they couldn't emotionally manage to live on their own anymore.
Cathy, now you've joined us here today to share your story of mothering an adult child who suffers from mental illness. Can you tell us about when and how you came to be in this difficult mothering situation?
Yes, about 15 years ago, when our son was 19, he had just finished school and had done really well throughout his whole younger years. Very creative, was a singer. He was an amazing writer and just a lovable, joyful young man he turned into. He had gone out to a Native American sweat with some friends near where we lived, and he took some peyote. So that triggered his brain to react in such a way that he ended up with schizophrenia. It all happened overnight. It was just so shocking for the family. He came home and he said the commercials on the television were speaking directly to him, and it was very upsetting. We just didn't know what was going on. He couldn't focus. He was very agitated. I got a hold of the family doctor right away and got an appointment pretty much the next day. Unfortunately, we heard the word schizophrenia, and that just really upset our son and myself. We went home, tried to figure out, what the next step was, although the doctor did give us a psychiatry referral. Our son had taken off, went to a park, and was starting to be told by what he said was a spirit to hurt himself. And we were just in a panic. We were told by the new psychiatrist, who he hadn't even met yet, to take him to emergency. So we did this, and they admitted him into their behavioral hospital, which was our first hospital experience with him. Our world had just turned upside down. We had never experienced anything like this before. And when we visited him at the hospital, he was over medicated and so unhappy and just wanting to come home. It was really, really hard to see him there. We didn't want to accept that this was something that was going to affect the rest of his life. We just wanted him to get better, and we wanted to help him continue on with the life that he wanted. And it was interesting because while we were there, a sweet woman came and gave us a handful of pamphlets about mental illness, and one of them was something from NAMI about their family to family course. And we were just in shock and at that point, and we were in denial that we even needed these pamphlets. He ended up coming home too soon, and which we didn't know, and went off the medication because it was just making him into somebody we didn't even know, and he was like a zombie. He couldn't really function. He ended up running off again, and we took him. We tried to get him back into the hospital, and they wouldn't accept him because he had acted like he was fine when he was sitting there with us. And he didn't seem to be a danger to himself, even though we knew he possibly could be. So we basically got him back home and got him finally to see this new psychiatrist who got him on a medication that didn't have as many side effects. So he ended up liking this psychiatrist, and that helped. But for us, we were in shock for quite a while that this had even happened. And it took him a long time to get even close to what would be something that we remembered him being all those years. So after that, he was in and out of the hospital a couple of times because he would go off the meds. And then we got him finally to a facility that taught him to live on his own and start accepting his illness. But those first 3 years, I'd have to say, were pretty much a nightmare for us and him, just not knowing what the future held and what this was really all about. There was a lot of anxiety and panic.
And now you said it's been 15 years and you've been living with your son managing a serious mental illness ever since, I understand. And I'm interested in the ways in which that has impacted your life and what's been difficult for you about mothering an adult child with mental illness.
The most difficult part is, I believe, is when he goes off his meds and he's in psychosis and he has no insight. Because at that point, it's so hard to talk to him and hold a conversation. And he's just in another world. And sometimes he even likes being in that other world. Uh, and we're trying to let him know that, the medication is going to help him be more grounded in this world. Sometimes he doesn't want to hear that, and that's super difficult.
I think just to build on what Cathy's saying, one of the strains of what I call difficult mothering is the particular challenge when your child is in psychosis, that it really makes, as mothers, we like to believe that we are able to tune into our kids and able to get through to them. But when your kid is in psychosis and refusing to take medication due to anosognosia, where they really don't realize they have an illness, this is really what difficult mothering is. It's impossible to reach your kid, and it feels so awful, and you feel so helpless.
It does. It feels like they're gone.
I've heard that's one of the scariest things for people is to look into their child's eyes and not see them there. I've heard that from many mothers and parents that they just don't see who they think they know behind those eyes when they're in an acute illness phase like that.
I'd have to say it's extremely scary. It's a very scary feeling to have them lost like that right in front of you.
So, in many of our state of mind episodes, we focus on the experiences and the many hardships of those who are experiencing the mental illness or substance use problems. But for this show, we're specifically trying to focus on the unique experiences of the mother of the adult child with those challenges. So, Kathy, can you talk some about the impacts this kind of difficult mothering has had on your mental health?
Yes, definitely has triggered PTSD episodes where I can't, breathe normally. I might have some anxiety. There's definitely panic that comes back. And it's hard to function on a daily basis when our son's in psychosis. A lot of fear and anxiety and panic that comes in.
Judy, in your book, you discuss the toll on mothers when their adult children have untreated mental illness or substance use problems. Can you elaborate on that and share what some of the mental health impacts of older women who find themselves in these prolonged mothering situations experience?
I think the toll happens, in several factors emotionally. Um, there's like sort of Kathy describes in those first 3 years, you're sort of living on high alert, where you don't know when the next shoe is going to drop, when your son or daughter is going to disappear. And as Kathy said, it feels like PTSD, that you're always, way up there in terms of worrying. So there's also the strain of not knowing. Some kids, where they're in psychotic episodes, just disappear. They take off, and you have no idea where your son or daughter is. And this is just horrible. And it can last for months, can last for a year. I've talked to moms where for a whole year they didn't know where their child was. So many of the women that I talk to in the groups that I run and in people I interviewed for the research, there's a sense that even though you have other kids who are doing really well and you're getting, immense pleasure out of new grandchildren, there's in the back of your heart some sorrow that stays with you. And using the concept which social workers had created years ago for parents who had Down syndromes, I think is applicable here, that you just sort of have to learn to live with this chronic sorrow that may just pop up. Suddenly you're at a wedding of your niece or nephew and you're so happy for them. And then suddenly you're faced with remembering that your daughter is not going to be walking down the aisle, and you just feel bad for her and for you.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're taking a deep dive into the unique struggles of mothers with adult children facing mental illness and addiction. These mothers often navigate an emotional and complex journey as they provide care while also trying to protect their own well-being. We'll hear from expert Judith Smith, a New York-based psychotherapist, professor, and researcher on women's issues. We're also joined by Cathy Pereyra, a mother of an adult child with serious mental illness, and a NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, volunteer parent support group leader. Later in the program, we'll also hear from older women who find themselves in this difficult parenting situation. Back to our interview. Judith, I want to come back to you and just ask, so what are some of the common misconceptions people tend to have about motherhood as it relates to adult children?
Well, most of us, when we have kids, assume that, we're taking on a commitment that's going to be, we now call it intensive mothering, that we're certainly going to feel in the first year of the baby's life, where we're not going to be able to shower, we're not going to have time for ourselves. And, most of us think, but it's going to get better. Eventually, they're going to be able to, not be diaper trained. And I'm going to be able to take a shower without, being afraid my kid's going to, something's going to happen to them. So we assume that within a couple of years, our children will become more mature, more able to be independent. Um, but if your adult child's illness or substance problem now is interfering with their able to be self-sufficient, where they can't work and they can't be financially independent from you, then suddenly our conception of what our mothering career is going to be is completely changed. Suddenly you're being asked to be involved in active parenting all over. And this is not what most of us think about when we begin our parenting career. I mean, some people within the first year of life discover that their child has a chronic illness and that they will be active caregivers, or they'll have to find alternative arrangements for their kids as they get older. But most of us assume that our kids will be able to move on. For those mothers who do take on, allow their kids to come home and sort of sacrifice their own well-being, or that's how it looks to outside people. Sometimes friends or family or even mental health professionals will tell them that they're being enablers or they're being codependent. And I really reject these labels, because what I discovered by talking to all the women that I talked to is that the reason these women are taking this on is not because they need the company and not because they have their own needs to continue to, baby someone. It's because they don't see any other alternative for how their children are going to stay safe.
Judith, you described that so well. I mean, I can so relate to, and other mothers would be able to relate to that as well. The fact that we, first of all, have that sorrow for such a very long time, that our child isn't able to do these milestones that our friends' families or their children are doing, and there's a lot of grief with that comes up. And then also the description of, yes, we aren't codependent, we definitely have a child with a disability. They can't function like other people can, and they do need that support.
That is the stigma of mental health, is that it's never called codependence when there is a physical disability.
Right.
But when there is a mental disability, we label it within this context of codependence. Kathy, as you're talking, it makes me think of another term that I've heard called ambiguous loss, and about the difficulty of grieving a kind of loss that never ends. It just goes on and on. And I wonder, Judith, if you have anything to share from your interviews about that experience and maybe how it relates to chronic sorrow.
They're definitely connected. Obviously, losing a child to death, to suicide is horrible, but it's something people, your friends and family, see as a concrete event. You know, they know how to come to a funeral. They know how to come to a shiva. They, know how to grieve if you have lost someone. If your adult child has not achieved their milestones and is not going to get married, is not going to have kids, and you're carrying this tremendous grief, other people don't see it. They don't know what you're feeling. And there's no ceremonies in our society to acknowledge where people and the community can come and share in your grief and hold you. So you're really left very alone. And it's a loss that only you know, and that's why it's called ambiguous, because it's a tremendous loss, but it's something that other people don't know. They may think, well, Johnny's going to get better. And, if she just let him grow up, he'll be okay.
And like your chronic sorrow, it's a grief that gets restimulated again and again and again.
I think, just to add, I think part of the challenge of being a mother in this situation is being aware that this chronic sorrow is going to pop up at all kinds of moments. And, you just have to learn, like ice skating. You just sort of have to learn to let it come and sort of say, oh, here it is. And that's what's happening. And you will get through it.
Kathy, I want to talk some now about how mothering of an adult child with mental illness affected your other relationships. How has this difficult mothering situation shaped your relationships with friends, with family, other parents, and even your community?
When our son first became ill, the friends that we had back then, um, it was hard to share with them the stress we were going through, the shock we were going through, and all the intimate details of what was happening in our home. There was a lot of stigma back then, more than we feel now, and embarrassment, shame, and we didn't even really know ourselves the whole complete picture of what was going on. So it was very hard to open up to friends in the past that we had. Plus, their kids were doing great, going to college, graduating, having their milestones, and we weren't experiencing that at all. And it was really hard to be around that. There was a lot of sadness and grief that would come up, and we didn't feel comfortable sharing that either when other families were having these, positive, fun experiences going on. And then you bring it up to date to now because of the community feelings we've had and experienced through NAMI and learning to fight the stigma and be comfortable sharing what we were going through little by little. We noticed that if we shared with friends, and even new friends, the honesty of what was happening with one of our children, we ended up helping them because there's so many families with something going on, and they were happy to hear that somebody else had resources for their loved ones or friends that had loved ones that needed that support. So slowly we've been breaking the stigma and reaching out more in the community and with our friends and getting a lot of support back. So the friends we have now, we have more of a bond with that we probably wouldn't have had if we didn't have our son with this mental illness.
There's, in sociology, they talk about different kind of relationships that we have. There's what are called weak ties and strong ties, and it's assumed that the important relationships are our friends and our family. But when something like this happens and friends and family, as Cathy describes at the beginning, just aren't able to understand or once too embarrassed to share all of it, research shows that you end up having to turn to more formal ties, to join organizations like NAMI. And even though some people might say, I don't want to go talk to strangers about my problems, it's actually these more formal ties where you have something in common around the problems with your kids that more open and honest relationships are able to emerge and become really the lifesaver for people in this with kids and having these problems.
Certainly, that's been true for me in my own experience of raising an adult child with mental illness. I often said that my experiences with NAMI were a lifeline and that those relationships that I developed through that continue to be. So, as we're talking about relationships, Kathy, what impact has the difficult mothering of a difficult adult child had on your marriage?
There is definitely added stress, um, as would any illness in a family put on that family. My husband has been an amazing support. I'm very fortunate that he wants a good life for a son just as much as I do. And he's open to new strategies that I might learn from my therapist or going to family therapy with our son. But obviously, when our son has to move back into our home and we have to rearrange our lives, it is so stressful at times. And there's definitely more arguments that happen more easily because of that stress. And it can be very hard on our relationship, but we do try and find new ways to find support and get through those hard times. It's just, it's not fun. It's not a fun time a lot of the time.
Judy, I can imagine in your research and in your support groups that you run that you've seen the whole gamut of how mothers of difficult adult children with mental health and substance use and underemployment problems impacts other important relationships in that mother's life. Can you share about what you've seen?
Yeah, it's very, very hard because there's so many decisions to be made. And there's issues of how much money should we give our son and daughter. There's questions about should we try tough love? And all people see this differently. And I think there probably is a gender difference in all of this. There is evidence from research that women experience more guilt than men. As one mom said to me, my husband does not bleed on the inside like I do. He's able to laugh with our daughter, but I think many women are bleeding on the inside and somehow experience their husbands as not sympathetic or not empathic enough. And it's very, very hard to even stay married when this is going on. Recently had somebody in my group. They were in their 70s. The husband was already retired. Their son was very ill and had been living in a housing situation supported by the state, but he smoked cigarettes, was very destructive to his room, and he was evicted. But there was absolutely no place for him to go in their whole community because he smoked cigarettes and he would not stop. And he had been evicted. And the parents were in a terrible bind. The father wanted them to use their retirement savings to buy a building so they could be the landlords and let him smoke. But this was an investment they couldn't afford. And so it was a terrible strain on their marriage. And I think there are many other examples I could tell you, but it's, when you're in an impossible situation and you have to make decisions as a couple, it's very, very hard.
I've experienced the smoking issue when our son has come home as well. And it's something that a lot of the people with this illness rely on, and that's a tough one.
So, Judy, stigma and guilt are often hard to separate when it comes to parenting children who are not able to thrive. In reading your book, both stigma and guilt significantly impact mothers who find themselves in these difficult mothering situations. Can you talk some about how both play out in the lives of these mothers?
Yes, I mean, shame and guilt are the most prevalent emotions that every mother reported feeling with me. Nearly every single mother that I talked to told me how it was, in what way it had been her fault that her adult child got ill or started using substances. That this idea that mental illness or substance use is created by our nurturing is in our culture, and we have all taken it in. And some researchers call the problem so wide and common, even within my own profession, that it's been called mother blaming. Years ago, a very prominent psychiatrist wrote papers and give lectures that say that autism was caused by refrigerator mothers, by cold mothers. And this was seen as psychological truth. We now know it's completely ridiculous and that autism is a neurological disorder. But there's so much lack of understanding of mental illness that people assume that it's all about how good a mother you were, and that if you were a really good mother, you would not have a kid who had problems. So every mother feels tremendous guilt and feels shame when other people would know that she has a troubled child.
Well, even after that era of the refrigerator mother came the era of dysfunctional families producing mental health conditions. And so, that was the next wave of that interpretation, and that's still prevalent today and still exists within our mental health systems and how often family members that are trying to care for their loved one are treated. It still plays out. Kathy, can you share specifically how you experience stigma and or guilt associated with having a child with mental illness? And does this impact you differently than you see it impacting your husband?
With the shame, I have definitely felt that. And it's funny because I realize there's no reason why you should feel the shame, but you do. And I love my son so much, and yet I feel shame about somehow I created this and there's nowhere I could see where I ever could have. So it's just been such an oddity for me. The stigma I have felt is when we go out with our son and he might be doing hand movements in the air, and people are looking at us, or looking at him, and my heart just goes out to him because he has no control of this thing he's doing when he's not quite baseline. But that's mainly when I have felt that, or maybe when we have shared it with other people and they don't understand it at all. They just don't want to hear about it, and they just want to not really have that conversation with us. That's when I have felt stigma. My husband and I both have felt this, so I don't think it's different for he or myself.
I think in terms of shame, there's also the shame that many mothers feel because this is such a hard situation. Sometimes one's really angry at one's own kid, and one really, at moments, hates your kid for being in this situation and putting you in this situation. And I think this is a really hard feeling for mothers to feel. Even mothers of healthy toddlers feel shame when they get angry at their kids. As mothers, we somehow have this idea we're supposed to only have positive feelings about our children. And when you have a child who is so troubled, you feel angry at them, you feel helpless. And I think mothers often blame themselves for having these mixed feelings. That's part of being human. Nobody is perfect. But I think for mothers whose kids are so vulnerable, when we have really negative feelings about them, we often feel like we're being a horrible mother or a horrible person.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm Deborah Sloss, your host, and today we're exploring the unique and often heart-wrenching challenges faced by mothers of adult children struggling with mental illness and addiction. We're joined by Judith Smith, a psychotherapist, professor, and researcher on women's issues, and Cathy Pereyra, a NAMI, volunteer parent support group leader, who shares her personal experience as a mother navigating this journey. Stay with us as we continue to share their stories and insights, along with voices from other mothers who've been through it too. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes. We've also added transcription and closed captions, so go to www.stateofmindmedia.org to find all of that. Now, let's get back to our interview. So, Judy, can you share some from your research and experience about why women in particular find themselves in these difficult parenting situations, often without their partners? And what does that say about women's roles in both our mental health systems and our society at large?
Well, first of all, I only interviewed women for my study. And I did this both for methodological reasons. I could only have a small sample as a qualitative researcher and couldn't control for gender. But I also did it on theoretical basis. I don't think parenting is the same for men and women. I don't, to say parenting rather than mothering or fathering, I think parenting is not gender neutral. There's a gerontologist, Nancy Hoyman, who writes, she's actually based in California, and she writes about caregiving. And the idea that we use a gender neutral term for caregiving is a little silly because it's primarily women who are doing the unpaid caregiving in our society. It's women who are the preschool teachers, it's women who are the uh, caregivers for older people when they need an aid. It's mostly daughters who are coming to help their frail parents, or mothers who are uh, pulling themselves out of the workforce if they have a child with chronic illness.
Or when we have a global pandemic?
Right. Women's work is cheaper, and that women end up being the ones who do the unpaid caregiving. And if we had very different public policies surrounding mental illness and substance use treatment, families would not have to be the 24-hour default safety net for their kids. If we had policies that supported free housing for people who were vulnerable and couldn't work, employment opportunities with mentoring for people who, everybody needs work that's meaningful, and improved access to longer term psychiatric care and affordable rehab, mothers wouldn't have to be stepping in all the time. Every mother who's providing care to her adult child, I assume, would prefer to have the support of others helping her child and helping her than having to be, the person who's on the 24-hour alert. So, I actually started the study as a clinical psychologist, really curious about how individual women handled the stress of having a child who had a lot of problems. But I emerged from the study really thinking a lot about the structural problems in our society and how that both of how women's roles are defined and our broken mental health system and substance use treatment systems, that there are real structural problems that are leading mothers to become the person who has to put out all the fires. And this really has to change, and hopefully it will.
So, Judy, are there resources you'd want to share for those mothers who find themselves parenting adult children with mental health or substance use problems?
Well, I think joining a support group is the best thing you can do for yourself. NAMI is a wonderful resource. They offer support groups that are free, and they're in every state. They're now online. Al Anon is completely free, where you can go, and there are Al Anon groups specifically for parents in some cities. And there are also private people who offer support groups, as I do, for moms of difficult adult children. So you have to decide which group is best for you and force yourself to go. It may feel like I don't want to talk about my kids to strangers. I don't want to bring their problems out in public, but it's really essential for your well being. And the more, like with the oxygen tank, the more you take care of yourself, the more energy you will have to be able to continue in the long run to be there when your adult child needs you. I mean, one mom who came into my group in the first session, she started to cry. She said, I can't tell you what it feels like to be surrounded by other women who understand what I'm talking about. And they don't judge me. And she just felt she didn't know the heavy burden she was carrying in her heart, but there was something miraculous that she felt when she discovered the group. And research has shown that joining a support group is the best way, and a support group with other people who are, quote, in the same boat as you are, is the best way to really alleviate and learn how to cope with your stress.
I also want to mention that your book, Difficult Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change, is also a wonderful resource for any parent going through something like this. So, Judy, what last points would you want to leave listeners with?
I think the first is you are not alone. And having a fuller life isn't going to take away from your son or daughter. You can continue to be as committed as you want to be to being there when your son or daughter needs you. And you can also take care of yourself. This is a long journey. And the more you can find support for yourself, your son and daughter will be able to benefit, as well as their siblings who may not have an illness.
Kathy, what would you want to say to other mothers who find themselves in this difficult role of parenting adult children with mental health challenges?
Pretty much everything Judith said was right on. Please reach out. Definitely get a therapist. I think that's one of the first things that's super helpful as well. Someone that you can share with. And gosh, that pretty much does it.
In the preceding interview, we explored the unique challenges of mothering adult children facing mental health and substance use struggles. This journey can be complex, exhausting, and at times even dangerous, a reality far from the vision of motherhood many imagine. Yet for countless mothers, this is the years-long reality they navigate every day, with too many of their stories left untold. In this segment, we'll hear from mothers who reached out to share their experiences and how connecting with others facing similar challenges has made a difference in their lives. This montage was created by Suki Wessling, my colleague and the creative force behind the Babblery radio show and podcast.
I'm 52 years old and have 3 children. My middle son is 21 years old with mental health problems.
I'm a 63-year-old mother of 3. My difficult adult child is my son. He's diagnosed with bipolar 1 with psychotic features.
Since my son became ill at age 27 with a serious mental illness, the practicalities of dealing with his illness and all the accompanying issues, jail, homelessness, anosognosia, which is the inability to recognize that he's ill, so therefore, his medication non-compliant, disappearing for months and even years at a time.
I live in the UK and I was trying to find a support group for parents with adult children who's struggling with mental health issues. I couldn't find anything. Having a child with mental illness, his started at 5 and really peaked at 7 years old, was very isolating, especially back then. He's 22 now. Because there was a lot of judgment about him being in the hospital, about him being on medications, about him living in a residential school.
He went missing. His roommate called us, concerned that he had not shown up for his shift, nor had he returned home to the apartment that evening. I panicked, and my husband flew out to find him, searched for a couple of days before he actually found him in an emergency room with no identification.
One of the biggest impacts of my son's illness is the impact it has had on my other relationships. I had kept so much of my family's experience to myself that I did not realize the toll it was taking on my well-being.
If you add that with the feelings of guilt that I felt because of his illness, inadequacy, shame, this started to really consume me over time. So I found it's not really easy to share my experiences and feelings with family and friends. They empathize, but I found myself wanting to actually protect them.
I felt myself detaching from friends and family because I didn't want the judgment. I didn't want the questions. And it angered me as well because they weren't in my shoes. I was mourning what I thought my son's life would be as I watched other people's children thrive.
He would have many ups and downs on a regular basis. Because he was living with me, I witnessed them all the time. I did everything tiptoeing around, trying to quell the rage, trying to have hope that things were going to change, always having hope that things were going to change, but things never changed.
It wasn't because they necessarily pushed me away or I pushed them away. He occupied so much of my time because I was so invested in his treatment that it just took such a large part of my life, and it was exhausting. Plus trying to work a full-time job.
You know, someone had told me 8 years ago that his condition was just going to get worse. I don't know if I would have been able to really, go on at that point with it. It's sort of like when someone's telling you that something's going to last this long, and it is really a lifetime thing. So that's why I think support is really, really important.
I don't like when people ask me, how is your son doing? They don't realize, for me, how loaded that question is. It might just be like, he's okay, when actually that's just relatively speaking, right? Okay could just mean like, okay, he didn't get the cops called on him today, or, he's not in the hospital, or, so forth and so on.
That really was a risk to my mental health, to my sobriety. I'm in recovery for alcohol, to my relationships with my children and my husband, not just mental health, but other health issues too. The stress would cause me incredibly, high blood pressure, etc.
They worry about me and my emotional and physical health. They understand to an extent like that's your son and you love him, but they also are just like, at what point are you just going to just keep trying at the expense of your own life and health?
I'd never been in the presence of a group of women who had this very painful thing in common. I felt so emotional after the first group, a flood of relief.
It's given me a new perspective. I get hope from the other women. Some have been mothers for twice as long as I have. Some have been less than I have. And
we really help and support each other. We can talk openly and confidentially, and we all understand what we're all going through because we're all going through the same thing. My therapist had recommended that I join, and I'm so happy that I did because I found other mothers that were going through the same struggles as far as just the guilt, the tug, the pull, the emotional drain, hearing what they were saying about their children, and it sounded exactly like my son. I was like, oh my goodness, it was so much relief, like, oh my God.
Don't hesitate. You don't have to suffer during these difficult mothering experiences on your own.
There was one particular woman in my group I found quite wise, so I would hang on to every word she said. Despite the hours she spent helping her adult son, she seemed to have a life. She was even taking dance lessons.
Focusing on the parent, on the mother, and how we can improve our mental health, how we can improve our quality of life.
It's almost more like a course or like a facilitated session in how to imagine and implement too, like another way of being, like sort of being able to see hope for myself that is separate from what my adult child is going through.
Ironically, I do have hope for the future for myself, but I don't necessarily have any hope that my son will get any better. I don't rule it out either. It's just that at this point, I just don't have any expectations.
because to have expectations means to be let down.
I'm not really to blame for my son's mental illness. As a good mom, I don't have to keep sacrificing myself. I didn't cause it, I can't control it, and I can't cure it. The best thing I can do for him is find some joy in my remaining years and in whatever connection I can find with him and with others.
There's no human on this earth that I love more than him. But at the same time, there's no human on this earth that has hurt me as much as he has. It's just too painful to just keep being disappointed. No one knows how to raise a child with mental illness. And so I can't say that I failed because I tried my best.
You've been listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well.
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 Our heartfelt thanks to Suki Wessling for creating that piece. For more stories about working, parenting, creating, and advocating as women, tune into the Babblery podcast, where those conversations continue. I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Judith Smith and Cathy Pereyra, and to all our In Your Voice story contributors. And thanks to you for joining us. To learn more, check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you really do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Youssef Hassanein for audio production, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Patty Palmer for transcriptions, Rebecca Levy for media outreach, Sarah Altman for community outreach, and Katrina Tattenham for advanced research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. To vocalist Lisa Taylor for use of her song Just Breathe, and to Chris Zabriskie on Bandcamp for use of the song Everyone Will Notice, No One Will Say Anything. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.